The leather was worn smooth, darkened by decades of handling to the color of rich coffee. It felt warm, almost alive in Clara's hands, a stark contrast to the cheap, plastic-encased digital bodies she was used to. The yard sale was a typical suburban tableau of forgotten lives spread across patchy grass, tables laden with mismatched Tupperware, stacks of yellowed paperbacks, and clothes that had long since gone out of style. But this object, this solid, brick-like Argus C3, sat alone on a corner table, a relic from a different era of craftsmanship. It was a beautiful, heavy thing, a machine built to last. The old man running the sale, a figure slumped in a folding chair with a newspaper held up like a shield, barely glanced up when she approached. "How much for the camera?" she asked. He lowered the paper, his eyes roomy and disinterested. "The old brick? $5, take it, just want it gone." He went back to his news before she could even fish the money from her pocket. There was no story, no fond reminiscence about the camera he'd used to capture his children's first steps. It was just an object, an inconvenience. That, in itself, was the first strange thing. A camera this well cared for, with its leather case intact and its lenses free of dust, felt like it should have a history, a story attached to it. Instead, it was being discarded like a broken appliance. Clara was a photographer by trade and by passion, though recently the passion had felt more like a chore. Her commercial work paid the bills, but her personal projects, the ones that were supposed to feed her soul, felt stagnant. She was adrift in a sea of technically perfect but emotionally empty images. She saw the world through a lens, but lately she hadn't truly seen anything at all. This camera, this brick, felt like an anchor. It was a piece of analog history in her hyper-digital world, a promise of a different way of seeing. She paid the man, and the Argus felt like a secret in her bag as she walked home, its weight a pleasant grounding presence. Back in her apartment, a space characterized by clean lines and the cool glow of monitors, she placed it on her kitchen table. It looked alien and wonderful there. She ran her thumb over the film advance lever, feeling the satisfying mechanical click. She peered through the viewfinder, the world through it dim and slightly warped, a portal to the past. It was then, as she was fiddling with the bottom latch, that she felt it. A slight resistance. She flipped the camera over, her curiosity piqued, and pried open the back panel, expecting to find the empty, light-sealed chamber where a film canister should go. It wasn't empty. Nestled inside was a roll of 35mm film, the canister a dull silver, its brand name faded. A small rectangular tab of paper, the film leader, was peeking out, indicating it hadn't been fully rewound. Someone had taken pictures with this camera and then, for some reason, had just stopped. They had left a roll of memories inside, sealed away like a time capsule, and then sold the entire vessel for $5. A chill unrelated to the apartment's air conditioning traced a path down her spine. This was no longer just a vintage find. It was a mystery. The decision to get the film developed felt like a transgression. These were not her memories. They belonged to the anonymous person who had held this camera before her, the person who had looked through this same viewfinder and chosen to capture these specific moments. Yet the pull was irresistible. It was a story left unfinished, and she, a storyteller by nature, felt an undeniable urge to know the ending. The next day, she took it to the last remaining old-school photo lab in the city, a place that smelled of chemical fixer and had stacks of photo envelopes yellowing in the windows. The technician, a man with silvering hair and ink-stained fingers, handled the camera with a reverence that matched her own. "An Argus C3, he whistled softly. "Haven't seen one of these in the wild in years. You're lucky the back was sealed tight. This film, it could be 20, 30 years old, maybe more. We'll have to develop it manually, push the process. No guarantees what we'll get. Could be nothing but light leaks and fog." He told her to come back in a week. A week. The wait was an exquisite form of torture. Every time she looked at the empty space on her kitchen table, she wondered about the images trapped in that canister. Were they of a family vacation, a child's birthday party, or were they something more mundane, something that would make her feel foolish for her curiosity? When she finally returned, the lab was quiet. The technician handed her a thick manila envelope. "We got something," he said, a note of professional pride in his voice. The emulsion was degraded, but there were frames. Some are pretty washed out, but others, they came through. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid the photos out. They were not glossy digital prints, but matte finished with a slight grain and a color palette that was both faded and impossibly rich. The first image was a close-up, so close it was almost abstract. It was a pair of hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, resting on a worn wooden table, The hands were elegantly shaped, one holding a delicate floral teacup. There was a sense of profound stillness to the image, a moment of quiet contemplation. The next photo was taken from a low angle, looking up at a child's red tricycle, its chrome handlebars glinting in a sun-dappled yard. The focus was soft, dreamlike. There was no child in the frame, only the ghost of their presence, a symbol of abandoned play. A third photo showed a view from an upstairs window, looking down on a quiet, tree-lined street. A single car was parked in the distance. The perspective felt lonely, almost confining, like the photographer was a prisoner in their own home, watching the world go by without them. Each photo was a fragment, a piece of a puzzle with no reference points. There were no faces, no clear identifiers. It was a visual diary of a life, but the author's name had been meticulously erased. And then she turned to the fourth photo. It was different. The composition was less deliberate, more candid. It was a woman sitting in what looked like a sunroom, her head thrown back in a peal of laughter. Her eyes were crinkled at the corners, and her mouth was open in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the first time she saw a face, and the effect was staggering. The woman was beautiful, with high cheekbones and dark hair swept away from her face, but it was her eyes that held Clara captive. Even in the midst of laughter, there was a deep, abiding sadness in them, a shadow that the joy could not quite dispel. It was the look of someone who had known great loss. Clara stared at the photograph, feeling a strange and powerful connection to this stranger, a woman captured in a single, paradoxical moment of sorrowful laughter. Who was she? What had made her so sad? And why, Clara wondered, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. Were these moments, these intimate fragments of a life left behind? Clara spread the photographs across her kitchen table like a deck of tarot cards, each image a fragment of a fortune she was meant to interpret. The scent of darkroom chemicals still clung faintly to the prints, a ghostly perfume from the lab. In the sterile, minimalist light of her apartment, the photos felt even more like artifacts from another world. The woman's laughing face, the lonely tricycle, the old hands, they formed a constellation of unanswered questions. She was no longer just a photographer who had bought a camera. She had become an unwilling custodian of a stranger's soul. The initial thrill of the find had curdled into a profound sense of responsibility, a feeling that these images were not just objects, but cries for help that had gone unheard for decades. She spent the rest of the day poring over them, her own work forgotten. She noticed details she'd missed in the haste of the lab. In the photo of the woman laughing, a single delicate silver chain was visible around her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her blouse. In the shot of the child's tricycle, the grass around it was patchy and dry, suggesting a long, hot summer. The next photo in the sequence was another interior shot, a close-up of a book lying open on a side table. The pages were yellowed and the text was slightly out of focus, but the title on the cover was unmistakable. A collection of poems by Emily Dickinson. Clara felt a shiver of recognition. The reclusive poet, whose work was filled with themes of death, immortality, and the inner workings of the soul, seemed like a perfect companion for the woman with the sorrowful eyes. It was a clue, not to her identity, but to her inner world. The following photo deepened the mystery. It was a stark, beautifully composed image of a windowsill. On the sill, facing the glass, was a small, hand-painted ceramic bird, a sparrow, its head cocked as if listening to a song only it could hear. The window itself was dirty, the view outside blurred and indistinct, creating a powerful sense of confinement. The bird, a symbol of freedom and flight, was trapped, just like the photographer. Then came the seventh photo, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was a picture of a closed door. It was a plain wooden door with a simple brass knob, but the way it was shot made it feel deeply menacing. The camera was positioned low, looking up, making the door seem to loom. The lighting was dramatic, with a single sliver of light from beneath the door cutting through the oppressive darkness of the hallway. It wasn't a snapshot. It was a statement. It felt like the end of a line, a point of capitulation. Why would someone take a picture of a closed door? Was it a barrier they couldn't cross? A secret they couldn't face? The image was so full of quiet dread that it made the hairs on Clara's arms stand up. This was no longer just a poignant story of a lonely life. There was something else here, something darker and more complex. The emotional tenor of the roll of film had changed, and Clara felt a growing unease. She was no longer just an observer. She felt like she was trespassing on a scene of profound emotional distress. Her professional curiosity morphed into a full-blown obsession. She cleared a large corkboard in her studio and began pinning the photos up, connecting them with pieces of string like a detective mapping a conspiracy. The Dickinson book was linked to the woman's laughing face. The ceramic sparrow was linked to the view from the upstairs window. The closed door stood alone, a dead end. She lived with these images, surrounding herself with them. She found herself talking to the woman in the photograph, asking her questions. "What were you running from?" She'd whisper to the empty room. Who was behind the door? In the woman's story, Clara saw a reflection of her own creative stagnation. The closed door was her own writer's block, her own inability to move forward. The woman's sorrowful laughter was the feeling she had when she captured a technically perfect, but soulless image. This mystery wasn't just about a stranger anymore. It was a mirror, and solving it felt like the only way she could save herself. She must have looked at the photo of the laughing woman 100 times, studying every detail, every shadow. It was the heart of the mystery, the one image that contained both joy and immense pain. One evening, as the last rays of the sun cast long shadows across her studio floor, she noticed something she had never seen before. It was in the reflection on the glass pane of the sunroom door, just over the woman's shoulder. The reflection was distorted, warped by the curve of the glass, but there was something there. Her heart began to pound. She grabbed a magnifying glass from her desk, her hands shaking with anticipation, holding it over the print. The blurry reflection swam into focus. She could see the edge of a table and on it the corner of a newspaper. The print was tiny, almost illegible, but she could just make out the headline. It was about a local town festival, and below it, clear as day, was the date, June 14th, 1987. The date hit her with the force of a physical blow, June 14th, 1987. The mystery was no longer a timeless ghost story. It was anchored to a specific day, a specific moment in history. The woman was not an abstract concept. She was a person who had lived, breathed, and felt on a Tuesday in 1987. The camera was not just old, it was a time machine. The roll of film wasn't just forgotten, it was a message in a bottle that had been floating for over 30 years, and she was the one to find it. The corkboard was no longer a collection of sad, disconnected images. It was a timeline. It was a crime scene. And she, Clara, was no longer just a custodian. She was an investigator. The closed door wasn't just a metaphor anymore. It was a real door, in a real house, that she now had a real chance of finding. The date, June 14th, 1987, became a mantra, a key turning in a lock that Clara hadn't known existed. The abstract sorrow of the photographs had solidified into a tangible point in time, a historical event she could touch. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of minimalism, now felt like a war room, the corkboard a map of a life in crisis. Her own photography assignments faded into the background, the client's demands for headshots and product photos sounding like a language from another planet. Her entire world had shrunk to the dimensions of that 35mm film strip. The first logical step was the internet. She spent hours in a digital haze, searching for Local Town Festival June 1987, a query so broad it returned millions of useless results. She tried cross-referencing the Argus C3 with sales records from the 1980s, a futile exercise in data mining. The digital world, with its promise of infinite knowledge, had failed her. It was too new, too clean. This story was analog, written in paper and ink, and it demanded an analog solution. The breakthrough came from the newspaper itself. The headline about the local town festival was the only specific geographical clue she had. She began a systematic, painstaking search of town websites and local historical society pages for any town that held a major festival around that date in 1987. It was a needle in a haystack problem, but the haystack was finite. After 3 days of near-constant searching, she found it. A small town in the Hudson Valley called Millfield had held its annual Founders Day Festival on June 14, 1987. A post on the Millfield Historical Society's blog even featured a scanned photo from that year's parade, showing a crowd cheering as a high school marching band passed by. The cars in the background, the style of the clothes, it felt right. It felt like the world from the photographs. A new resolve hardened within her. She had to go to Millfield. The next morning she packed a bag, leaving her professional cameras behind. The only camera she took was the Argus C3, a silent, heavy passenger on the seat beside her. The drive was a meditation. She left the sprawling grid of the city behind for winding country roads lined with ancient maples. The air changed, growing cleaner, sweeter. She was driving back in time, chasing the ghost of a woman she'd never met, Millfield was exactly as she'd pictured it, a quaint, picturesque town centered around a green with a white steepled church. It felt like a place where secrets could be kept, where stories could sink deep into the soil and stay there. Her destination was the Millfield Public Library, a beautiful brick building that looked as old as the town itself. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling of old paper and floor wax. She explained her mission to the head librarian, a woman named Martha with kind eyes and a bun of silver hair. "Microfiche," Martha said with a knowing nod, leading Clara to a humming machine in a quiet corner. "We have the entire archive of the Millfield Chronicle. If it happened here, it's in there." The next few hours were a blur of whirring film and scrolling text. Clara fed spools of microfiche into the machine, her eyes scanning the glowing screen. She watched the weeks of May 1987 tick by, ads for lawn mowers, reports on town council meetings, a high school baseball victory. Then, she found it. The June 14th, 1987 edition. The front page was dominated by a large photo of the Founders' Day parade, the very image she'd seen online. There was a thrill of validation, a feeling of finding the first piece of a puzzle. But the article itself was just a fluff piece, a cheerful account of the day's events. It told her nothing about the woman with the sorrowful eyes. Her heart sank. Was this it? Was this the whole story? A woman who lived in a town that had a festival? It felt anticlimactic, a dead end. But something, a deep instinctual pull, told her to keep looking. She advanced the film, scrolling past the society pages and the classifieds. Her eyes scanned the headlines, looking for anything at all. And then she saw it. It wasn't a headline. It was a small 3-paragraph brief tucked into the bottom of the local news section. The type was small, the text stark and unadorned. The headline read, "Search continues for missing boy." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. The article described the disappearance of a 7-year-old boy named Leo Vance, who had vanished from his backyard on the afternoon of June 13th, the day before the festival. It mentioned a massive search party, police involvement, and the parents' agonizing wait. And then, it gave the parents' names, Thomas and Ilara Vance. Ilara. The name hit her like a physical blow. The world tilted on its axis. She looked up from the screen, her eyes unfocused, the librarian's gentle hum a distant drone. Every single photograph flashed through her mind in a new, terrifying light. The laughing woman was Ilara Vance, the mother of a missing child. The photo of the abandoned tricycle wasn't a symbol of a child grown up. It was a crime scene, a memorial to a vanished little boy. The view from the window wasn't loneliness. It was a mother's vigil, her eyes scanning the street for a sign of her son's return. The Book of Dickinson poems wasn't a hobby. It was a lifeline to a poet who understood grief better than anyone. The hands holding the teacup weren't just old. They were the hands of a woman aged overnight by an unimaginable horror. And the closed door, it wasn't a metaphor. It was Leo's bedroom door, closed forever, a space that could no longer be entered. The laughing photo, the one she had found so beautiful and paradoxical, was now the most heartbreaking image she had ever seen. It was a portrait of a woman clinging to a memory of joy, a desperate attempt to hold on to the person she was before her world was shattered. Clara sank back in her chair, the microfiche reader's light illuminating the tears streaming down her face. She wasn't an investigator anymore. She was a witness. She had stumbled upon a monument to a mother's grief, a roll of film that was not a diary but an elegy. The name hung in the sterile air of the library, a single word that had retroactively colored every image, every shadow, every sliver of light on the roll of film. Ilara Vance. Clara's fingers traced the outline of the name on the glowing screen, the pixels feeling like tombstones under her touch. The story was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a tragedy to be witnessed. The abstract sorrow she had felt from the photographs had now crystallized into a specific, agonizing human reality. A mother, on the second day of a living nightmare, had picked up a camera and tried to capture the fragments of her world before it shattered completely. The laughing photo was not a portrait of joy. It was a desperate act of defiance against the encroaching darkness, a final frantic grasp at the memory of happiness. The library, with its hushed reverence and scent of aging paper, felt like the only appropriate place to receive such a profound and terrible truth. She was not just a photographer who had found an old camera. She was an archivist of a stranger's deepest pain. A quiet, powerful instinct took hold. She had to see it. She had to stand on the same ground, breathe the same air, see the same view that Alara had seen through her lens. Armed with the name and the town, she asked the librarian, Martha, for an old street directory from the late 1980s. Together they pored over the maps, their fingers tracing the inked lines of Millfield's neighborhoods. They found it on a street called Willow Creek Lane. The name itself sounded peaceful, a cruel irony for a place that had known such turmoil. Clara thanked Martha, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the world outside feeling sharper, more vivid, and infinitely more fragile. Willow Creek Lane was exactly as the photographs had promised it would be. It was a beautiful, tree-lined street, the mature maples forming a canopy that dappled the road in shifting patterns of light and shadow. She drove slowly, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, comparing the real-life view to the images seared into her memory. And then she saw it. A modest, single-story house with a small, neatly kept lawn. It was the house from the photo of the upstairs window. The paint was a different color now, a modern beige instead of the faded white in the picture, and the car in the driveway was new, but the bones of the place, the shape of the roof, the position of the windows were unmistakable. This was it. This was the stage for Alara's elegy. She parked across the street, killing the engine. For a long time she just sat there watching the house. It looked so normal, so peaceful. A child's bicycle, a modern one with bright colors, lay on its side in the driveway. The sight of it was a physical blow, a painful reminder of the red tricycle that was no longer there. She felt like an intruder, a voyeur peering into a wound that had been closed for decades. But she knew she couldn't leave. She had to complete the circle. She got out of the car, the Argus C3 feeling heavy in her hands, and walked across the street, not to the front door, but around the side of the property, toward the backyard. This was the emotional climax, a silent, devastating communion across time. She stood where the tricycle had been, the grass now lush and green. She looked up at the upstairs window, the same window Alara had stared out of, and felt the crushing weight of her vigil. She walked to the back of the house and found the sunroom, its large glass panes reflecting the afternoon sky. She could see the shape of the table, the faint outline of the chairs. She raised the Argus, peering through the dim viewfinder, framing the empty room. In that moment she was no longer Clara. She was Alara. She felt the phantom ache of a mother's love, the hollow space where a child's laughter should be. She understood with a clarity that shattered her that the photographs were not an attempt to document a life, but an attempt to prove it had existed. They were a mother's prayer, a desperate plea to the universe not to forget her son. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, and she let it fall. This was the human impact. This was the story the camera had been waiting 35 years to tell. She didn't take the picture. Lowering the camera, she felt a profound sense of closure, not for Alara, but for herself. The creative block that had plagued her for months suddenly felt insignificant. She had been chasing beauty in perfect compositions and technical precision, but she had forgotten that true art comes from empathy, from the courage to look at the world and see not just what is there, but what is felt. Alara's photographs, technically imperfect and emotionally raw, were more powerful than any image Clara had ever taken. They were a testament to the fact that the most profound stories are not told with grand gestures, but with quiet, aching details. She walked back to her car, a changed person. The camera in her hand was no longer just a vintage find. It was a sacred relic, a vessel that had carried a mother's love across decades. As she drove away from Millfield, leaving the house on Willow Creek Lane behind, a new thought began to form, a final, lingering question that opened up the story once more. The yard sale where she'd bought the Argus wasn't in Millfield. It was in her own town, over 200 miles away. The old man had been so dismissive, so eager to be rid of it. He wasn't Alara. He wasn't family. He was just a man clearing out junk. So how did the camera get from Alara's hands in 1987 to a folding table in a stranger's yard 35 years later? The camera was a traveler, a silent witness. It had carried Alara's story to her. What other stories had it held in its dark chamber along the way? And where would it go next, now that its latest keeper knew the weight of the secrets it could keep? The Argus C3 was not just the end of one story. It was a vessel, waiting for the next.